Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. As we get closer to the 250th anniversary of 1776, we're going on a journey today that is absolutely going to transform how you look at one of the world's most famous cities. We're going to trace the echoes of 1776 and take you through the landscapes, battles, and heroes of the era. And as you'll see, New York City's familiar waterways quite literally dictated the survival of the American Revolution.
So, let me just ask you this directly. What if the greatest battlefield in American history is hiding right in plain sight? I mean, when we think of the Revolutionary War, our minds usually jump straight to those wide-open green fields in Lexington or, the snowy woods at Valley Forge. But what if I told you that the bustling, concrete-laden geography of modern New York City was actually the most tactically complex battleground of the entire war? Today, we're shifting our perspective. We're going to look at the city's geography, not just as a bunch of neighborhoods, but as a high-stakes, intensely contested maritime system.
Okay, let's dive right into this massive contrast. If you look at the New York waterfront in 2024, it's all engineered public promenades, sleek ferry terminals, and beautiful, peaceful spots like the Hudson River Greenway. But 250 years ago, this edge looked absolutely nothing like it does now. In 1776, there were no continuous bulkheads or seawalls. The land met the harbor in this chaotic series of irregular muddy inlets, completely exposed shorelines, and totally treacherous salt marshes. It was a wild, high-energy environment that very quickly turned into a heavily militarized coastal edge. Honestly, understanding this untamed, dangerous geography is the key to understanding everything that happened next.
Just to give you a sense of how unbelievably fast all of this unfolded, let's look at the rapid sequence of the 1776 campaign. We have the British Armada arriving in July, the Staten Island landings in August, followed just days later by the East River Retreat, then Harlem Heights in September, and finally the fall of Fort Washington in November. It was a breathless, devastating few months that literally almost extinguished the American cause. In this explainer, we aren't just rattling off dates. We're going to follow this narrative spatially, journeying coast by coast, to see exactly how the water and the land shaped these critical moments.
Let's start right in the thick of it. The summer of 1776. 400. That is the number of terrifying British vessels that showed up in New York Harbor. Just imagine standing on the shore of Staten Island or Brooklyn and seeing a literal forest of ship masts filling up the water. No way you wouldn't be terrified, right? It was one of the largest expeditionary forces of the 18th century. They basically turned the harbor into a floating military city of 32,000 soldiers. The sheer scale of this threat was entirely unprecedented.
So why did the British bring this massive armada here, of all places? Well, because, as George Washington astutely observed, these islands and waterways were the strategic key to the continent. Washington knew for sure that whoever controlled New York's harbor and its deep river corridors controlled everything, the movement of troops, supplies, and communication between the northern and southern colonies. The Hudson River wasn't just some scenic backdrop. It was an absolutely crucial military line that could have severed New England from the rest of the rebellion completely.
The setup, the Narrows in Staten Island. Let's head over to the southern gateway of the harbor. This is the tidal pinch point through which literally every ship entering New York has passed for centuries. By July 1776, this narrow stretch of water was the most heavily scrutinized place on Earth. Up on the heights of Staten Island, British sentries were just peering through spyglasses at the Continental defenses right across the water in Brooklyn, totally setting the stage for the invasion.
And then, on August 22nd, the invasion kicked off with terrifying mechanical precision. 15,000 British and Hessian troops were ferried across the Narrows from Staten Island over to Gravesend Bay in Brooklyn. Think about that number. This wasn't just a simple river crossing. It was the largest amphibious landing in the Atlantic world up to that point. Wave after wave of infantry poured ashore in these specially built flat-bottomed boats, kicking off the massive Battle of Long Island.
Which brings us to a really devastating phase of the campaign. The Trap. Brooklyn and the Gowanus Marshes. Long before Gowanus was an industrial canal, that creek wound inland through broad salt marshes and these really muddy tidal flats. As the American defensive lines started to collapse, retreating soldiers found themselves caught in an absolute nightmare of a trap. Men were sinking into deep mud while trying to carry heavy muskets and gear. Others tragically drowned, trying to cross the deeper tidal channels while taking heavy enemy fire. The landscape itself literally became the enemy.
But amidst all that chaos and disaster, we find some truly incredible heroism. Enter the Maryland 400.
Over near present-day Park Slope and the Old Stone House, this small regiment of roughly 400 Patriot soldiers launched repeated, desperate counterattacks against a vastly larger British force. They knew the odds were impossible, but their sheer stubbornness and sacrifice delayed the British advance just long enough to actually give the rest of Washington's army a fighting chance to retreat toward the East River.
Watching this desperate stand from up on the heights of Brooklyn, George Washington reportedly uttered these totally heartbreaking words. "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." Many of those 400 men were killed or captured. It's a stark reminder of the incredibly high human costs exacted by this coastal battlefield. Their sacrifice is a profound echo of 1776 that honestly still resonates in the streets of Brooklyn today.
Following that crushing defeat, we arrive at the true climax of our survival story. The Continental Army had retreated to Brooklyn Heights, but they were completely trapped. This brings us to the miracle, the East River escape. Nowadays, we casually cross the East River on massive steel bridges or zoom right under it in the subway. But in 1776, this narrow, turbulent tidal strait was the only thing standing between the American Revolution and total, utter annihilation. The tension here was just unimaginable. You've got 9,000 American troops pinned against the Brooklyn shore. Their backs are to the water, and they're staring down the barrel of the entire British army. Oh, and the British fleet is sitting right nearby. Total destruction felt inevitable. They had to somehow get across a river, infamous for its violent shifting tidal currents, and they had to do it entirely under the cover of darkness.
Now, what's absolutely fascinating about this sequence is the unbelievable precision required to pull it off. Step 1, they had to frantically scramble to assemble every single flatboat, ferry, and fishing vessel they could get their hands on. Step 2, row 9,000 men, plus their horses and heavy artillery, across those fierce currents in absolute pin-drop silence so they wouldn't tip off the British warships right next door. In Step 3, well, as dawn broke, they were still exposed, but a providential, incredibly dense fog settled over the river out of nowhere, entirely obscuring them from British eyes. By the time the fog lifted, the British charged in and found an empty camp. That river literally became their thin blue line of survival.
So, who actually managed to pull off this miracle? Let's take a minute to spotlight some unsung heroes of the waterways. The boats in that nighttime escape were manned by Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Mariners. They were a diverse, rugged crew of fishermen soldiers from Massachusetts, and their deep local knowledge of tides literally saved the day. Then you have Mary Lindley Murray, who brilliantly, and super politely mind you, stalled British General Howe and his officers by inviting them in for tea and cakes. She literally bought the Americans crucial hours to slip past. And we can't forget Margaret Corbin, who bravely took her fallen husband's place, firing cannons at Fort Washington until she herself was severely wounded. The revolution survived because everyday people like this completely stepped up.
Okay, let's move our spatial story northward now to a new strategic vantage point, the corridor and the fall along the Hudson and Harlem rivers. In 1776, elevation was the ultimate currency. Since the British could easily project naval power deep into the Hudson Valley, American survival depended entirely on controlling those river crossings and holding the high ground so they could monitor enemy movements.
The underlying geology of Manhattan was actually highly tactical. Take Point of the Rocks, up in present-day St. Nicholas Park, for example. It's this massive outcropping of Manhattan schist. From this natural rock balcony during the Battle of Harlem Heights, Washington monitored the British lines. And it was right here that the British light infantry sounded a mocking tally-ho fox hunt bugle call, basically taunting the retreating Americans. Well, that insult completely backfired. It spurred a fierce American counterattack, proving they could actually hold their ground, and turning that rocky landscape into a lasting symbol of defiance. But despite that awesome momentary victory at Harlem Heights in September, where a young Alexander Hamilton helped hold the line, the geography ultimately dictated their defeat. The situation went downhill fast. By November 16, Fort Washington fell in a devastating assault. Hessian and British troops swarmed straight up the steep 200-foot muddy slopes right from the Harlem River. Nearly 3,000 Americans were captured. It was the largest single American capture of the entire war. A totally crushing blow that forced Washington to abandon Manhattan completely and retreat across the Hudson into New Jersey.
Which brings us to the hidden front, spies, whaleboats, and stone walls in Queens and the Bronx. With Washington's army pushed out, the conventional lined-up battles in the city were over. But the war? The war certainly wasn't. Now our focus shifts to the outer reaches of the city.
For the next 7 long years of British occupation, these sprawling, marshy coastlines transformed into a shadowy, clandestine struggle of surveillance, espionage, and daring shoreline raids. This northern coastal war was entirely defined by chaos and divided loyalties. It's like a giant puzzle of secret operations. The famous Culper Spiring used the protected coves of Long Island Sound to smuggle vital intelligence right to Washington. And it was incredibly dangerous work. Patriot leaders paid a heavy price. Francis Lewis, who literally signed the Declaration of Independence, had to watch his Whitstone estate get completely bombarded by British warships. His property was destroyed, his wife was imprisoned. Meanwhile, small, super-maneuverable whaleboats operating under the cover of darkness became the ultimate tactical tool. Patriot raiders would silently row across the Sound and actually kidnap high-ranking British officers right out of their farmhouses. I mean, how wild is that?
And I have to highlight just one more incredible echo of 1776 up in the Bronx, the Battle of Pell's Point. Remember Colonel Glover and his amazing fishermen soldiers? Well, in October 1776, the British tried to land behind Washington's army to cut off their retreat. But Glover, brilliantly using the local terrain, positioned his 4 regiments behind a series of successive stone walls in Pelham Bay. They fought this intense, rolling defensive battle, absorbing the massive British advance by firing multiple volleys and then falling back to the next wall. It was a stubborn, genius stand that gave Washington the exact amount of time he needed to escape safely to White Plains.
All of this leaves us with an incredible maritime legacy stretching coast by coast, 250 years of endurance. While the muddy redoubts and wooden forts of 1776 have long been replaced by concrete expressways, towering high-rises, and modern parks, the actual maritime geography, the tidal straits, the glacial ridges, those deep water channels, remains entirely unchanged. The river that saved the Revolution is the exact same river that flows under the bridges today. The very landscape of the city we know was fundamentally shaped by these battles.
Which leaves me with one final question for you. How will you look at the water the next time you stand on a city pier? Because the next time you look out at the harbor, or cross over a bridge, or take a walk along a waterfront promenade, I really want you to look closely. The ghosts of 1776, the heroes, the incredible sacrifices, and the tactical survival of a brand new nation, they are all still right there, hiding in plain sight. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep exploring and keep learning.